With a hidden talent that saves his ranch, his Christmas bride arrives as Ethan Walker had always believed that land remembered the footsteps of those who loved it. When he was a boy, he used to run across the wide fields of his family's ranch, chasing the wind and pretending he owned the whole world. Back then, the grass was thick and green, the cattle were strong, and laughter often drifted out from the farmhouse porch. His father would stand near the fence line, hands resting on his hips, proud and steady. His mother would wave from the kitchen window, calling him in before supper got cold. Now, years later, Ethan stood in that same field, but the world felt much smaller. The grass beneath his boots was dry and thin. The soil had cracked under months of harsh sun. The sky seemed endless, but instead of freedom, it carried silence, the kind of silence that made a person think too much. The Walker Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. It was more than land. It was history, memory, and promise. His grandfather had built the first wooden barn with his own hands. His father had expanded the cattle herd slowly year by year. And when his father passed away the previous winter, Ethan had promised himself that no matter what happened, he would protect this place. But promises are easy to make when the weather is kind. This year had been different. The rains had come late, and when they finally arrived, they were not enough. Crops failed in certain sections. The price of animal feed went up again and again. Fuel costs rose. Repairs that could once wait could no longer be ignored. A section of the barn roof had started to sag. The tractor made a strange sound every time he started it. Fences needed replacing. Every morning Ethan woke before sunrise. He pulled on his boots, stepped outside into the cold air, and told himself the same thing. Just keep going. He fed the cattle, checked the water supply, and walked the perimeter fence. He worked with steady hands, even when his thoughts were racing. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table had become something he disliked looking at. It was covered in envelopes, bills, notices, reminders. He stacked them neatly, as if neatness could make them less serious. At night, he would sit under the dim light reading numbers again and again, hoping they would somehow change. They never did. The ranch had once supported not only his family, but 2 hired hands as well. Now Ethan worked alone. He could not afford extra help. He had sold a portion of the herd earlier in the year just to cover expenses. Watching the truck carry them away had felt like losing something personal. Those animals had been raised on this land. He knew each one by sight. Neighbors had begun to talk quietly. Small towns always noticed when things changed. They saw fewer cattle in the fields. They saw Ethan working later than usual. Some offered kind words, others simply nodded in sympathy. No one said it directly, but everyone knew the ranch was struggling. As December approached, the air turned colder. Frost settled on the fence posts each morning. Normally, this time of year brought a simple kind of happiness. His mother used to decorate the porch with pine branches and hang a wreath on the door. She would bake pies, and the smell would fill every corner of the house. His father would cut a small cedar tree from the back of the property and place it near the fireplace. This year, there were no decorations. Ethan told himself he was too busy, but the truth was it did not feel right to celebrate when everything felt uncertain. The farmhouse, once warm and lively, now echoed when he walked through it. Some evenings, he caught himself listening for sounds that would never return. The loneliness pressed on him more than he liked to admit. It was during one particularly long evening that he opened a letter that would change the direction of his winter. The letter was from a family friend who lived 2 towns away. It spoke about a woman named Clara Bennett. She had grown up in a farming community but had recently been running a small bakery in town. Unfortunately, business had slowed and she had been forced to close it. The letter was careful in its wording. It did not speak of romance or dreams. It spoke of practicality. Clara was kind, hard-working, and searching for stability. Ethan, in his own way, was searching for the same. At first, he folded the letter and set it aside. The idea seemed strange. Marriage had always felt like something that would happen naturally, not something discussed through careful suggestions. But as weeks passed and the ranch's situation became more serious, he found himself thinking about it again. He did not want to lose the ranch, and he did not want to face the future completely alone. After some hesitation, he wrote a simple reply. That was how the letters began. Clara's handwriting was neat and thoughtful. She asked about the land, the cattle, the seasons. She shared small stories about her bakery, how she used to wake before dawn to prepare bread, how she enjoyed seeing familiar faces each morning. There was no complaint in her words, only honesty. Ethan found himself waiting for her letters more than he expected. In the evenings, after finishing his chores, he would sit by the window and read them slowly. For the first time in months, his thoughts were not only about bills and repairs, they wrote about practical matters too. If she were to come to the ranch, she would understand that life would not be easy. He made sure she knew that. He did not hide the struggles. Clara's responses never showed fear. Instead, she asked questions, smart questions about how the ranch operated. As winter settled in fully, they came to an agreement. Clara would arrive just before Christmas. They would marry quietly at the small church in town. It would not be a grand event. It would simply be two adults choosing partnership over uncertainty. Still, as the date grew closer, Ethan felt a mix of emotions he could not easily explain. One afternoon, while repairing a section of broken fence, he paused and looked out across the land. Snow clouds gathered in the distance. The fields looked tired but patient, as if waiting for something better. He wondered what Clara would think when she first saw the ranch. Would she see potential, or would she see only problems? Would she regret her decision? That night, he cleaned the spare bedroom carefully. He fixed the loose handle on the dresser and replaced a cracked window latch. Small tasks, but they mattered. He even brought in fresh firewood and stacked it neatly by the fireplace. The house needed more than repairs. It needed life. A few days before Christmas, Ethan drove into town to settle a small payment at the bank. The conversation there was polite but firm. If improvements did not come by spring, more serious steps would need to be discussed. He nodded, understanding what was left unsaid. As he stepped outside, snow began to fall lightly. The town square was decorated with simple lights glowing softly in the evening air. Families walked past carrying packages. Children laughed near the bakery that had once belonged to Clara. For a moment, Ethan imagined her standing beside him, seeing this place not as a reminder of loss, but as a beginning. When he returned to the ranch that night, he stood quietly in the barn. The cattle shifted gently in their stalls. He reached out and ran his hand along the wooden beam his grandfather had carved decades ago. The wood felt solid, steady. "I'm trying," he whispered into the quiet space. The wind outside grew stronger, carrying snow across the fields. Inside the farmhouse, the lights glowed softly against the darkness. Everything felt fragile, balanced between failure and hope. Ethan did not know whether her coming would truly change the future of the ranch. He did not know whether two strangers could build something strong enough to face storms, debt, and doubt. But as he stood there listening to the winter wind, he allowed himself one small, careful thought. Maybe this Christmas would not be the end of the Walker Ranch. Maybe it would be the start of something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. The morning Claire Bennett arrived, the sky was pale and heavy with snow clouds. Ethan had been awake since before sunrise, though he had barely slept. He told himself it was because of the cold air creeping through the old farmhouse windows, but deep down he knew it was something else. Today, his life was about to change. He stood outside near his truck, brushing a thin layer of frost from the windshield. The ranch stretched behind him, quiet and still. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. The cattle moved slowly in the distance, their breath visible in the cold air. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday. Yet nothing felt the same. The bus from the neighboring town arrived only once in the afternoon. It stopped at a small station near the grocery store, a place that rarely saw visitors. Ethan arrived early. He leaned against his truck, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the empty road. He tried to picture Clara clearly in his mind. He had only seen one small photograph she had sent months ago. In it, she stood in front of her bakery, smiling softly. There had been flour on her sleeve and sunlight in her hair. The picture had seemed warm, but photographs did not show how a person spoke, how they walked, how they looked at the world. When the bus finally appeared, rolling slowly through the light snowfall, Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. The vehicle stopped with a soft hiss. The door opened. Several passengers stepped down first. An elderly couple, a young man carrying a suitcase. Then he saw her. Clara stepped down carefully, holding a single brown suitcase in one hand and a small cloth bag in the other. She wore a simple blue wool coat and a knitted scarf wrapped neatly around her neck. Snowflakes landed gently on her dark hair. She paused for a moment, looking around as if taking in the town for the first time. She looked smaller than he expected, but there was something steady in the way she stood. Ethan straightened and walked forward. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The world felt strangely quiet. "Clara?" he asked gently. She looked at him, and recognition filled her eyes. "Ethan," she replied, offering a small but sincere smile. Their handshake was polite and slightly awkward. Both of them were aware of the unusual situation. They were not strangers exactly, but they were not yet familiar either. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," Ethan said as he took her suitcase. "It was fine," she answered. "The snow made it slower, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to think." He nodded, unsure what to say next. The words he had practiced earlier suddenly felt unnecessary. As they drove toward the ranch, silence filled the truck at first. The road stretched ahead, lined with bare trees dusted in white. Clara watched the passing fields carefully. She did not speak, but her eyes were observant. "It's quieter than town," she said after a while. "Yes," Ethan replied. "It usually is." When the ranch finally came into view, Clara leaned slightly forward. The barn stood tall but worn. The fences showed signs of repair. The farmhouse, though old, held a certain charm beneath the winter snow. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. He had expected concern, maybe even disappointment. Instead, her voice carried warmth. "It needs work," he admitted. "Most good things do," she replied calmly. That answer stayed with him. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan placed her suitcase near the staircase. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine cleaner. Clara removed her coat and looked around slowly, taking in every detail: the wooden beams, the worn but polished table, the faded curtains near the window. "It feels like a home," she said. He cleared his throat. "I tried to fix up the spare room." "I'm sure it's perfect," she answered kindly. Their first afternoon together felt careful and measured. Clara unpacked her belongings neatly. She had brought very little: some clothes, a few books, a framed photograph of her parents, and a small tin box she placed gently in the dresser drawer. Ethan returned to his chores outside, unsure whether to hover or give her space. As he worked in the barn, he found his thoughts drifting back to the house more often than usual. When he came inside later, he noticed something different. The kitchen table had been cleared. The envelopes and bills were stacked neatly in one corner. A pot simmered gently on the stove. Clara stood by the counter, stirring something with quiet focus. "You didn't have to cook," Ethan said. "I wanted to," she replied with a soft smile. "It makes a place feel warmer." The meal was simple but comforting. Fresh bread she had brought from town, thick soup made from vegetables and herbs she found in his pantry. They sat across from each other, speaking slowly at first, then more naturally. She asked about the cattle. He explained the challenges of the drought. She listened carefully, not interrupting. When he spoke about his father, her expression softened. "It must be hard managing everything alone," she said gently. He hesitated before answering. "It is." Over the next few days, Clara adjusted to ranch life without complaint. She woke early, often before Ethan. She prepared breakfast and sometimes stepped outside to watch the sunrise over the fields. The cold did not seem to bother her as much as he expected, but she noticed things: the sagging section of the barn roof. She noticed how carefully Ethan measured out feed, trying to make it last. She noticed how long he studied the ledger book each night. On the third evening, she found him sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at the columns of numbers. His brow was tight with worry. She poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of him. "May I ask something?" she said gently. He looked up. "Of course." "How long have the numbers looked like this?" "Most of the year." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. Her eyes scanned the pages quietly. Ethan felt a flicker of discomfort. This ranch had always been his responsibility. Sharing its weaknesses felt unfamiliar. But Clara did not judge. She did not sigh or shake her head. She simply observed. "You've been carrying the lot," she said finally. Gave a small, tired smile. "It's what I'm supposed to do." She looked at him thoughtfully, as if wanting to say more, but choosing patience instead. The days moved closer to Christmas. Snow covered the ground fully now, turning the ranch into a quiet white landscape. Clara hung a simple wreath on the front door, using pine branches she found near the back field. She placed a small handmade decoration above the fireplace. The house felt different, brighter somehow. One afternoon, Ethan returned from checking fences to find Clara in the barn. She stood near the cattle, watching them closely, not with uncertainty, but with interest. "They're calmer than I expected," she said. "They're used to people," Ethan replied. She nodded slowly, as if making mental notes. That evening, she surprised him again. "Ethan," she began carefully, "would you mind if I looked more closely at your ranch records tomorrow?" He blinked. "Why?" "I grew up helping my uncle with his farm," she explained. "I may not know everything, but I understand some parts of land management. Maybe I could offer a fresh pair of eyes." Her voice was steady but humble. Ethan studied her face. He realized that during these few days, he had mostly seen her as someone seeking safety, someone stepping into his world quietly, but now he sensed there was more beneath the surface. "You don't have to fix my problems," he said. "I'm not trying to fix them alone," she answered softly. I'd just like to help." Her words were not demanding. They were sincere. Outside, snow continued to fall gently, covering old tracks and rough patches in smooth white layers. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. For the first time in months, Ethan did not feel entirely alone at the kitchen table. Christmas was only days away. The ranch was still struggling. Bills had not disappeared. The roof still needed repair. But something subtle had changed. Clara had arrived as a practical arrangement, a solution born from necessity. Yet in just a few days, her quiet strength and careful attention had begun to shift the atmosphere of the ranch. Ethan did not yet know the full extent of her hidden knowledge. He did not yet realize how much she understood about land, planning, and recovery. But as he watched her gently close the ledger book and offer him a reassuring look, he felt a small but growing sense of hope. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that only winter could bring. Snow rested gently on the ranch, covering the dry patches of land like a clean white blanket. The sky was clear, and sunlight reflected softly across the fields. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. But inside the farmhouse, tension and hope sat side by side at the kitchen table. Ethan had already finished feeding the cattle when he stepped back into the house. He removed his gloves and hat, brushing snow from his coat. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Clara was sitting at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of her. Sheets of paper were neatly spread out beside it. A pencil rested in her hand. She looked up when he entered. "I hope you don't mind," she said gently. "I started reviewing the numbers." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's fine." But inside, he felt uneasy. Those pages held more than numbers. They held months of stress, long nights, and decisions he wasn't sure had been right. Allowing someone else to examine them felt like opening a door to his private worries. Clara noticed his hesitation. "I'm not here to judge," she said softly. "I just want to understand." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence. Clara turned the ledger toward him. "You've done everything you could with what you had," she began. "You cut costs where possible. You sold part of the herd at the right time. You delayed repairs to prioritize feed. That shows responsibility." Ethan blinked, surprised. He had expected criticism. Instead, he heard recognition. "But," she continued carefully, "the ranch needs a shift in strategy. Not more hard work, just smarter planning." "What kind of planning?" Clara reached for one of the blank sheets and drew a simple outline of the land based on the maps she had seen in his files. "When I was younger," she began, "my uncle's farm faced a difficult period. We had back-to-back seasons of poor crops. Instead of planting the same way each year, he began rotating sections of land differently. It allowed the soil to recover. Production improved without adding more expense." Ethan watched her sketch small sections on the paper. "You're saying I should change where I plant in the spring?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And not just that. Some areas of your land hold moisture longer. I noticed that when I walked the back field yesterday, and those sections could support winter-resistant crops, even small batches." He frowned slightly, thinking, "Winter crops are risky." "They can be," she agreed. "But if managed carefully, they can also bring early season income, especially if marketed well." "Marketed?" he repeated. Clara smiled faintly. "People in town care about where their food comes from, especially around the holidays. If we prepare bundled produce packages, simple things like potatoes, carrots, preserved goods, we could sell them as locally grown essentials." Ethan hesitated. He had never focused much on presentation. His father had always relied on bulk sales and long-term buyers. "That sounds complicated," he said honestly. "It's not," Clara replied calmly. "It just requires organization." She pulled out another page. "You're currently purchasing feed from 2 suppliers. If you partner with the Miller Ranch 2 miles west, you could place a shared bulk order and lower the cost per unit." Ethan looked up sharply. "The Millers don't usually cooperate." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Have you asked recently?" He paused. He had not. "You're carrying this ranch alone. That's admirable. But sometimes strength is not about carrying more weight. It's about knowing when to share it." Her words settled into the room. Ethan rubbed his hand across his jaw, thinking deeply. Pride had always guided him. The Walker Ranch had survived through independence, but independence was beginning to look different now. "And you're certain this could help?" he asked quietly. Clara did not promise miracles. "It won't fix everything overnight, but it will create movement. Right now the ranch feels stuck. We need forward motion." He studied her face carefully. There was no arrogance there, no attempt to take control, only quiet confidence. "All right," he said at last. "We'll try it." The decision felt small, but it carried weight. That afternoon, they began organizing. Clara helped Ethan review sections of land more closely. They walked across the snowy fields together, measuring distances, discussing soil conditions, and noting areas that would need attention when spring arrived. Ethan found himself explaining details he had never shared with anyone before, the way water naturally flowed after heavy rain, which fences needed full replacement, which cattle were strongest. Clara listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions. She did not rush him. She respected his knowledge of the land. By evening, the kitchen table looked different. Instead of scattered bills and confusion, it held plans, clear lists, revised budgets, and new possibilities. Over the next few days, Clara worked steadily. She drafted simple flyers by hand to place in town advertising holiday produce bundles. She visited the general store and spoke politely with the owner about displaying a small sign. Her calm and sincere manner made people listen. Meanwhile, Ethan swallowed his hesitation and drove to speak with Mr. Miller. The conversation was stiff at first. The Millers had their own struggles, but when Ethan explained the shared feed purchase idea, Mr. Miller considered it. "Times are tight for everyone," Mr. Miller admitted. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending we're not in the same boat." By the end of the discussion, they had agreed to place a joint order. When Ethan returned home with the news, Clara's eyes brightened. "That's a strong first step," she said. Days passed quickly. Orders for the holiday bundles began coming in, slowly at first, then steadily. Clara organized everything carefully. She calculated pricing that covered costs but remained fair. On the morning they prepared the first full set of bundles, the barn buzzed with quiet activity. Ethan loaded produce into crates while Clara arranged them neatly with handwritten labels. "You make it look easy," he said. "It's not easy," she replied with a small laugh. "It's just thoughtful." As they worked side by side, something shifted between them. The awkwardness of their first meeting had faded. In its place was partnership. That evening, as they stood near the barn doors watching the sunset reflect on the snow, Ethan felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Relief. The ranch was still fragile. There were still risks ahead. But for the first time since his father's passing, he felt like he was not carrying the weight alone. Later that night, while reviewing the updated ledger, he noticed something simple but powerful. The numbers had begun to change. Not dramatically, not magically, but slightly. And sometimes, a slight improvement is enough to keep hope alive. He looked across the table at Clara. "You didn't tell me you knew this much about farming?" he said quietly. She hesitated before answering. "I wasn't sure you would believe me." Why wouldn't I?" "Because people often see what they expect to see," she replied gently. "I used to run a bakery. Most assume that's all I understand." Ethan thought about that. "I'm glad you spoke up," he said sincerely. Clara smiled softly. "So am I." Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the barn walls. Snow shimmered under the moonlight. The ranch still faced challenges, but it no longer felt defeated. Clara's hidden talent had not only created a plan, it had created momentum. It had brought fresh thinking to old problems. And in the quiet warmth of the farmhouse, as the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, Ethan realized something important. Sometimes the greatest strength arrives quietly. By the time Christmas week arrived, the ranch no longer felt like a place waiting for loss. It still had its problems. The barn roof still needed repair. The fences still showed their age. But the air felt different. There was movement now. There was purpose. The first batch of holiday produce bundles had sold faster than Ethan expected. Clara had carefully wrapped each one in simple brown paper and tied them with twine. She added small handwritten notes that read, "From our ranch to your table." The message was not fancy, but it felt honest. People in town responded to that honesty. On the morning they delivered the second round of orders, Ethan loaded the truck while Clara checked her list. Snow crunched under their boots, the sky was bright, and the cold air felt sharp but clean. "You organized all this in less than a week," Ethan said, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. Clara adjusted her scarf and smiled. Sometimes people just need to be reminded that local farms are still here. As they drove into town, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen in months. He was not dreading the trip. Usually going into town meant facing the bank or overhearing quiet conversations about the ranch's struggles. But this time he carried something different in the back of his truck. They made their deliveries together. At the first house, an elderly woman opened the door with a wide smile. "I've been waiting for this," she said warmly. "It feels good to buy from someone nearby." Clara thanked her politely, while Ethan handed over the bundle. The woman paused before closing the door. "Tell your father I still remember when he used to deliver fresh corn in the summer," she added. Ethan swallowed gently. "I will," he replied softly, even though his father was no longer there. At each stop, the response was similar: gratitude, encouragement. Small conversations that reminded Ethan the ranch was not invisible. By the time they finished the last delivery, Clara's list was nearly complete. "We should consider planning something similar for early spring," she said thoughtfully. "If we start preparing now, we can create steady income instead of seasonal surprises." Ethan glanced at her. "You're already thinking ahead." She nodded. That's how farms survive. When they returned home, Ethan noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the barn. He frowned slightly. "Are you expecting someone?" Clara asked. "No," he replied. As they stepped out of the truck, Mr. Miller emerged from the barn doors. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Sam," Miller said, brushing snow from his gloves. "I stopped by to talk." Ethan felt a brief flash of worry, but Mr. Glove, Miller's expression was not tense. "I heard about your holiday bundles," Miller continued. "My wife bought one yesterday. She said it was well done." Clara offered a polite smile. Mr. Miller shifted his weight. "I've been thinking, if your spring rotation plan works out, maybe we could coordinate certain crops. That way we don't compete on the same products." Ethan blinked in surprise. Cooperation between neighboring ranches had always been rare. "That could benefit both of us," Clara said calmly. Mr. Miller nodded. "Times are changing. We either adapt together or we fall behind alone." After he left, Ethan stood quietly in the yard. "That's the first time he's ever suggested collaboration," he said slowly. Clara looked toward the snowy fields. "People notice effort. When they see movement, they respond." The days leading up to Christmas passed quickly. Clara continued refining the budget. She restructured payment timelines, prioritized repairs, and created a simple but clear schedule for spring planting. Ethan followed her suggestions with growing confidence. One afternoon, they stood inside the barn examining the damaged roof section. Snow had melted slightly, revealing weak boards beneath. "We can't afford a full replacement yet," Ethan said thoughtfully. "No," Clara agreed, "but we can reinforce the weakest area before heavy snow returns." It buys time. They spent hours working side by side, securing supports and sealing small gaps. Their movements had grown coordinated without either of them noticing. When Ethan reached for a tool, Clara handed it to him before he asked. When Clara adjusted a ladder, Ethan steadied it instinctively. Work no longer felt lonely. On Christmas Eve morning, something unexpected happened. Ethan drove to the bank with updated records in hand. Clara had insisted he show the recent progress rather than wait until spring. He felt nervous walking into the office. But he reminded himself that the numbers now told a different story. The bank manager reviewed the papers carefully. "You've increased local sales," the manager observed, "and reduced supply costs." "Yes," Ethan replied steadily. The manager leaned back in his chair. "It's early, but this is improvement. If this direction continues, we can extend your current deadline." Ethan felt a quiet rush of relief. "Thank you." When he returned to the ranch and shared the news, Clara's eyes shone. "That gives us breathing room," she said. "It gives us a chance," he corrected gently. That evening, as darkness settled over the land, Clara placed small candles along the farmhouse windows. Their soft glow reflected against the snow outside. Ethan brought in a small cedar tree from the back field, just as his father used to do. They decorated it simply. Twine, a few wooden ornaments Clara had brought from her suitcase, and a ribbon tied neatly at the top. The house felt warm. After dinner, they stepped outside together. The sky was clear, filled with stars. The fields stretched out quietly before them. "I didn't think this Christmas would feel like this," Ethan admitted. "Like what?" Clara asked. "Hopeful. Hope doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in small changes. When you first arrived, I thought you needed saving." Clara smiled faintly. "And now? Now I think you saved this ranch." She shook her head gently. "We saved it. Together." They stood in silence for a moment, watching their breath form small clouds in the cold air. For months, Ethan had carried fear quietly, fear of losing the land, fear of failing his family's legacy, fear of facing the future alone. But standing beside Clara, those fears felt lighter. The ranch was not fully secure. Spring would bring new challenges, weather could still shift unexpectedly, Markets could change. But something stronger than uncertainty had taken root. Partnership, trust, belief. Later that night, as they sat near the fireplace, Clara handed Ethan a small wrapped package. "You didn't have to get me anything," he said. "It's not much," she replied. Inside the paper was a simple wooden plaque. Carved into it were the words, "Walker Ranch, Stronger Together." Ethan ran his fingers across the letters, emotion rising quietly in his chest. "This means more than you know," he said. Clara smiled softly. "It's only the beginning." Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it did not feel heavy or threatening. It felt peaceful. The ranch still stood. The barn lights glowed warmly against the winter night. And inside the farmhouse, two people who had once been strangers now shared a sense of purpose. Christmas had not erased every problem, but it had marked a turning point. After Christmas passed, the ranch did not suddenly transform into a perfect success story. The fences were still old, the barn roof still needed a full repair, the tractor still made that strange sound when it started on cold mornings. But something important had changed, and it could be felt in every corner of the land. There was direction now. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip. The heavy snow softened into thin layers of frost. Water trickled along the edges of the fields during the warmer afternoons. The sky seemed wider, brighter. It was not yet spring, but it was no longer the deepest part of winter. Ethan stood on the porch one early morning, watching the pale sunlight stretch across the fields. Clara joined him with 2 cups of coffee. "You're thinking again," she said gently. "I am," he admitted, "but not the way I used to." Before Clara arrived, his thoughts had been filled with worry. Now they were filled with plans. They had spent the past weeks preparing carefully for spring. Clara's rotation strategy was mapped clearly on paper. Certain sections of land would rest. Others would carry new crops. They had already ordered seeds suited for the soil's condition. The shared feed agreement with the Miller Ranch had reduced costs more than Ethan expected. Small improvements were beginning to show in the ledger. One afternoon, as they worked together in the field marking new planting lines, Ethan paused and looked at Clara. Her boots were muddy. A few strands of hair had slipped loose from her scarf. She was studying the soil with focused attention, pressing it gently between her fingers. "You really love this," he said. She looked up. "I do. I thought you loved baking more than farming." "Baking taught me patience and precision. Farming teaches me trust." He considered that. "Trust in what?" "In time," she answered. "In the land. In effort." Her words stayed with him. The first signs of spring arrived quietly. Small green shoots began to push through the soil in the sections they had prepared early. It was nothing dramatic, just small hints of life. But for Ethan, it felt like a promise being kept. The town began to notice as well. The general store owner asked if they would continue the produce bundles in the coming months. A local cafe owner inquired about fresh vegetables for summer menus. Even Mr. Miller stopped by more frequently, not out of concern this time, but out of shared planning. One evening, the Millers joined Ethan and Clara for supper. It was simple: stew, fresh bread, and preserved vegetables from winter stock. The conversation was open and warm. "We've started adjusting our planting schedule, too," Mrs. Miller said. "It feels less risky knowing we're coordinating." The ranch was not just recovering financially. It was reconnecting with the community. Later that night, after the Millers left, Clara stood near the fireplace looking thoughtful. "You built more than a ranch here," she said. "Ah, your family built trust." Ethan nodded slowly. "I was so focused on saving the land I forgot about the people around it." "You didn't forget. You were just overwhelmed." Spring arrived fully by late March. The fields showed organized rows of new growth. The cattle appeared healthier with the improved feed plan. Repairs to the barn roof were scheduled now that finances had stabilized enough to allow it. One afternoon, Ethan received another letter from the bank. This time it was not a warning. It was confirmation that his account status had improved significantly. Continued progress would secure the ranch long term. He read the letter twice before walking outside to find Clara. She was near the fence line, checking the boundary posts. "It's working," he said simply, handing her the letter. She read it carefully, then looked up at him with quiet pride. "You did this," she said. "We did this," he corrected again. Over the following weeks, their partnership deepened in ways neither had predicted. They learned each other's rhythms. Clara preferred planning in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with careful notes. Ethan preferred early mornings, walking the fields before the day fully began. They balanced each other naturally. But something else had changed, too. The marriage that began as a practical decision had grown into something steady and warm. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was built in shared work, shared silence, and shared decisions. One evening, as the sun set behind the fields painted in soft gold light, Ethan turned to Clara. "When you stepped off that bus," he began, "I thought I was offering you stability." She smiled gently. "And now? Now I see you brought it with you. Stability isn't something one person gives. It's something two people build." He reached for her hand. This time, there was no awkwardness, only familiarity. As summer approached, the ranch looked stronger than it had in years. The crops grew evenly across the rotated sections. The new marketing approach created steady weekly sales rather than depending on one large buyer. The shared supply orders with neighboring ranches lowered costs further. Even the barn roof, now repaired, stood firm against heavy rain. One afternoon, Ethan walked alone through the field his grandfather once planted. He paused near the old oak tree at the edge of the property. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel pressure pressing against his chest. Instead, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the land that had endured, gratitude for the neighbors who had chosen cooperation over competition, and most of all, gratitude for the woman who had arrived quietly just before Christmas with more strength than he realized. When he returned to the farmhouse, Clara was organizing invoices for the next delivery schedule. "You're smiling," she noticed. "I was thinking about my grandfather," he said. He used to say, "The land rewards those who respect it." Clara closed the ledger gently. "You respected it even when you were afraid." He nodded slowly. "I was afraid of losing everything. And now? Now I'm not. Because even if storms came again, and they always would, the ranch was no longer standing on one pair of shoulders. It stood on two hearts working together." Late that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky fade into soft blue, Ethan realized something simple but powerful. Clara had arrived as his Christmas bride. But she had become much more than that. She had become his partner in every decision, his strength in moments of doubt, his reminder that solutions often hide behind quiet voices. The ranch was no longer a symbol of stress and uncertainty. It was once again what it had always meant to be, a home, and this time it felt fuller than ever. As fireflies flickered near the fence posts and the cattle settled peacefully in the barn, Ethan squeezed Clara's hand gently. "This place would not be standing like this without you," he said. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "It was always standing," she replied. "It just needed belief." The land had not changed overnight. The weather had not suddenly become perfect. The world outside their fence was still unpredictable. But inside that fence line there was balance. The ranch had been saved not by luck, not by sudden fortune, but by courage, cooperation, and quiet determination. And in the end, the greatest gift that arrived that winter was not just new ideas or financial recovery. It was partnership. It was trust. It was love built slowly through shared effort. The Walker Ranch stood strong again.